Jeon Tae-il was born in 1948 into one of the most economic pitfalls of Korean history. Korea had just gained independence from Japan in 1945, but the subsequent Korean War's destruction of infrastructure in the 50s led to economic downturn. At this point in history, the national GDP was approximately a minuscule $100. Born in Daegu to a tailor father and housekeeper mother, Jeon Tae-il's familiar situation was one of extreme poverty. Due to their financial predicaments, he and his siblings were forced to quit school and begin working in order to support the family. Soon, to escape their life in abject poverty, he and his family fled for Seoul seeking new opportunities. This period in their lives coincided with the miracle of Han River, meaning that rapid development of the country allowed Jeon Tae-il to obtain a job in 𝗃𝗺 market with the sewing skills he had learned from his father. Although a better situation than what he had faced back home, Jeon Tae-il was working 14 hours a day and received only 50 won for his labor, the equivalent of only a cup of tea at the time. Over time, Jeon Tae-il rose in the ranks of the sewing company, progressing from an assistant to a tailor and doubling his income. Despite his more fortuitous situation, Jeon Tae-il was still cognizant of the brutal working conditions and the lacking worker rights in South Korea. Female workers, called 𝗘𝗺, who were often as young as 12, worked 19 hours daily, often without proper breaks in the middle. The lack of sanitation within factories meant that illnesses such as pneumonia were rife amongst the laboring population. Once, Jeon Tae-il witnessed a 𝗘𝗺 coughing out blood. When he inquired into the state of her health, her chilling response was, "Please don't tell anyone, I'll get fired." Soon, she was. This moment was a momentous turning point for Jeon Tae-il. He too was fired after protesting the 𝗘𝗺's unfair dismissal. This sparked a fire in his heart for reform. Now, Seoul was not a place for opportunity for Jeon Tae-il, but an embodiment of worker oppression. However, his lack of formal education meant that he was relatively unknowledgeable about how to go about creating his reform. Furthermore, there were very few people that shared Jeon Tae-il's passion. Due to the ignorance from lack of education and the immense fear of losing their economic means, leaving him alone and powerless. Luckily, Jeon Tae-il's father was a former labor reform activist, and with the help of his father, Jeon Tae-il discovered that the extensive amount of labor the workers were going through was actually illegal. With the help of his family, Jeon Tae-il bought the Labor Code with Comments and Cases, a book on Korea's standard of labor laws, for 3,000 won, or approximately 1 month's wages. He then gathered his colleagues and formed what he called a Fools Association, a collective dedicated to fighting for the rights of laborers. However, this group's effort to apply equitable laws like the Labor Standards Act were often ignored by bureaucracy. For example, the Fools Association sent letters to the Labor Office demanding improvement in labor standards and sent a petition to the president, but all were rejected and were often simply ignored. However, their luck seemed to change for the better when the Ministry of Labor returned a letter back to them, assuring the collective that changes would be soon implemented. As time passed with no further word or action from the ministry, the Fools Association eventually realized that they were simply stalling for time. They simply wanted Jeon Tae-il to wait until the National Assembly's audit of state affairs was over. This annual assembly was designed for politicians to come together and discuss the organization of state agencies. By falsely promising future action to the Fools Association, the ministry allowed the assembly to take place without any threat of action from Jeon Tae-il. Enraged by the ministry's irresponsible behavior, Jeon Tae-il decided to take more drastic measures. He proposed that the association should burn the Labor Standards Act book as a form of public protest. After all, what is the reason that a law exists when nothing there is kept? Unfortunately, this information was leaked, and on November 13, 1970, Jeon Tae-il's proposed public demonstration was curtailed by police forces. It was at this moment that Jeon Tae-il poured gasoline over his body and set himself on fire. He ran out in front of 𝗃𝗺 market and shouted to the crowd, "Observe the Labor Standards Act! Don't abuse the workers!" He died hours later in the emergency room of St. Mary's Hospital. His final request was to his mother, Lee So-soon, prompting her to finish his life's work. She abided, forming the Cheonggae Cloth Workers Union, a great symbol of the Korean labor movement up until the late 90s. Jeon Tae-il's immense passion for the labor movement and the stark symbolic power of his final protest has had great influence on labor activism in Korea to this day. Although self-immolation alone is an awe-inspiring feat, what makes Jeon Tae-il an immensely worthy frontiersman of history is the tremendous effects that his sacrifice offered the country. After the death of Jeon Tae-il, there were immediate changes in workers' laws in Korea. while the standard was 14-hour workdays, wages of approximately 51 a day, and an average age of 15 for laborers. Jeon Tae-il's death ushered in a reworking of these conditions. Changes included the passing of the Labor Standards Act, which established minimum wages and defined working hours, and the Labor Union and Labor Relations Adjustment Act, which allowed the formation of unions and bargaining with employers. His death also surpassed the legal realm, as Jeon Tae-il's story led to greater public awareness and understanding of the plight of South Korean laborers and the importance of civil rights for all. However, there was less change when it came to shifting written legal doctrine to practical enactments of the law. Military dictatorships maintained a tight hold over South Korea for decades after Jeon Tae-il's death. The Park Chung-hee regime in particular promoted military-style industrializations in an attempt to modernize the country. What this really meant is that the continued oppression and exploitation of workers became a valid excuse for the high economic growth that the regime was aiming for. These authoritarian governments continued to suppress activists, often using propaganda techniques, such as calling them 𝗘𝗺, which means red people. In this way, the government tried to portray them as evil communists infiltrating the country from North Korea. And in even more extreme measure, the government also often used military force on peaceful protests. But the seed was planted. The reverberations of Jeon Tae-il's death had so much influence in Korean society that none of the government's measure could stop news from spreading.
전태일 열사의 분신 이후로 사회적으로 반향은 매우 컸어요. 특히 대학생들이 아주 엄청나게 뜨겁게 반향을 했고, 그 외에는 이제 노동운동계에서도 스트라이크를 하면서 우리도 전태일 열사의 뒤를 따르겠다, 뭐 이런 구호들이 많이 나오고, 하여튼 뭐 들불처럼 일어났다고 할 수 있죠.
Days after Jeon Tae-il's self-immolation, students at Seoul National University submitted a proposal to overhaul the brutal working conditions in factories. Following their lead, the National Christian Council also presented a petition to the government advocating for changing these same conditions. And on 23rd of November, only days later, a large collective of university students came together to honor the death of the frontiersmen and establish a new labor investigation team. Jeon Tae-il's sacrifice had a domino effect across the country and was not just confined to the issue of labor conditions. His death formed the foundations of evolving nationwide labor activist movements, but as these movements spread, they also encouraged the growth of anti-imperialist campaigns and democratic organizations in the 80s.
우리나라 노동운동의 새로운 역사를 개척하는 그러한 희생과 그러한 노력으로 비로소 우리나라의 그 민주화 운동이 시작이 됐고, 또 노동조합 운동이 비롯 거기서 시작돼서 1980년대를 거치면서 1987년에 시민 대항쟁, 그걸로 발전하는 결정적인 그 개척자로서의 첫 발을 내디딘 그런 일이었기 때문에 저는 전태일 동지야말로 이런 우리나라의 민주화 운동 또는 노동 운동 또 사회를 바꾸는 운동의 개척자였다, 이렇게 말할 수 있습니다.
The unity amongst groups of people, from university students to farmers, became the necessary groundwork for the nationwide democratization that shaped Korea into what it is today. South Korea has since become a democracy with a strong tradition of labor rights and worker protections. Jeon Tae-il's legacy and sacrifice have continued to be an important part of the country's history and its ongoing efforts to promote social justice and equality.